So welcome, and my name is Renee Skaggs, and I'm the Farm Planning and Agricultural Assistance Program Director at the Pierce Conservation District. And if you have any questions as we go along tonight in the presentation, just go ahead and put your questions in the chat, and then Margaret's going to answer all of them at the end of her presentation. So if you are not familiar with conservation districts, we were established after the Dust Bowl, and it came about because of bad agricultural practices. So conservation districts were established to help farmers protect their soil and their water and keep it on their farms and keep it productive and not cause natural resource disasters ever again. That's our mission. So as part of that, we have branched out over the years. We don't just work with agriculture producers. We work with landowners like yourselves that have some forest land. We work with urban folks, and we do a lot of stream restoration projects. We're non-regulatory, so we make recommendations. We don't tell people what they have to do. So we hope you're going to learn some stuff tonight. And this effort is, as you can see, a multi-conservation district effort. The districts on the west side received a grant to hire some cluster foresters that we share amongst each other. But this presentation series is a joint effort between the Kitsap, Mason, Thurston, King, and Pierce conservation districts. And Margaret Creeder is the shared cluster forester for our area. And Matt Axe is not one of the shared foresters, but he does the Firewise for the King Conservation District. And we also have with us tonight Levi Love, who's our AmeriCorps. Before Margaret starts her presentation, Levi, as part of his AmeriCorps term of service to help us out, he needs to basically find out how much information people are learning through our educational offerings. So before we get rolling here in a minute, Levi's going to put a quick poll up. So if you can answer the poll questions, and then after Margaret's presentation, he's going to recheck your knowledge gain and do a quick poll again. So go ahead, Levi.
Sweet. Thank you, Renee. I will launch this right now.
All right. Okay. Well, without further ado, Margaret is going to tell you about all the multi-benefits of forestry. Take it away, Margaret.
All right. Thanks, Renee. Good evening, everybody. As Renee already said, I'm Margaret Creeder. I'm one of the shared stewardship foresters for Mason, Kitsap, Thurston, and Pierce counties. And I work with Mark Mead to cover those areas. This is our third presentation in the South Sound Conservation District's Forestry Education Series, and we'll be doing our last one next month on April 21st at the same time. So my presentation here tonight is going to be an introduction for you into forest management and the various opportunities out there, and how you can achieve multiple benefits through the various management techniques that we use. So to start off, here's us doing some forestry. That's myself and Mark Mead and our technician Chase. So if you've seen our previous presentations, you'll have gotten a little overview of our programs, but I wanted to give a brief introduction to add some context for anyone who hasn't heard it before. We operate under two programs. This one, which is the Puget Sound Regional Forest Stewardship Program, which I cover Pierce, Kitsap, Mason, Thurston under, is a partnership throughout the Puget Sound area with multiple conservation districts. And then there's also the Southwest RCPP, which is a partnership with a few of the conservation districts in Southwest Washington, as well as the Fish and Wildlife and Natural Resource Conservation Service. Overall, the goals for the programs are fairly similar. The main goal is to be encouraging long-term management of forests and to provide education and build the connections that lead to greater retention of forests on landscapes over time. So I'm happy to answer more questions about that later, but to get into the real purpose of the presentation, I'm going to introduce some forestry concepts to you. So the background of a forester includes both qualitative and quantitative analysis, and we use that to, look at your forest land and kind of give you an opportunity to discuss with you how you want to take care of it. So we can provide recommendations for management of forest lands, and we base those recommendations off of our training, our field experience, and the latest research. Foresters in general are forward-thinking people, so we're always looking towards planning for the future and helping you reach your long-term management goals. So one distinction to be aware of when talking about management is there's two basic types, and it's commercial or non-commercial management. The simplest explanation is commercial means that a product is being created and sold. So most commonly that product is wood, logs going down the road. That's what we see a lot of around this area. As we'll continue to talk about later, there's a wide range of operations that can be considered commercial. So making an income from your forest land might be one benefit you're looking for, but even if it's not your main goal, knowing how to do that and have the potential to reinvest in improving your forest land is really important to long-term forest management. So non-commercial management is activities that are not producing a product, but they can be related to improving the value of forest products over time or improving your forest in other ways that will provide benefits. Some of those examples are, thinning very young trees that are small and growing really close together, as well as planting wildlife forage or cover. So here's a couple graphics depicting the overall cycle of the forest. This type of cycle plays out in all sorts of ways and occurs whether through natural disturbance or artificial disturbances. Looking at the chart on the left, most of the forests we see around the area are going to be kind of in those middle two sections. We're kind of always operating between, that open area and the middle-aged forests. We're talking 50 to 60 years maximum is some of what you would see around this area. Most of the forest land in our region has been managed in some capacity over the years, and with a better understanding of forest, we can improve on past management, and especially in cases where invasive species or other abnormal disturbances have tipped the balance. So forests can provide key ecosystem services in every stage of the cycle, and if we look at the chart on the right, we can see that for wildlife especially, different species often cycle out through the various stages of the forest as the resources change within that. So moving forward, I wanted to include a few pictures of within these forest stages where some active management could help with improving these forests. These scenarios are pretty common to what we see out in the field. And, if any of these ring true for you, then we're going to have some options we're talking about that will help. So on the left here, we've got the species selection. So we have C. Douglas fir competing with a hardwood canopy. And then we have a highly dense stand on the right that's really competing with each other. These next two you see on the left, a lot of downed trees. This is probably root rot damage. And then on the right, we have kind of a lack of diversity. There's not a lot growing up in that understory. You don't see a lot of regeneration there for trees. So there's options to manage, and it all depends on what you want. Before we go into those options though, there are a few things that I really want all forest managers or landowners to kind of take away. And it's 4 things. You should know your responsibilities with your forest land. You should know what you have. You should know what you want to accomplish, and you should know where you go for help. So responsibilities can include, regulations and taxes, especially. So just knowing how those regulations operate, how they work. There's definitely people you can talk to in our, I'll have some links towards the end of specific people to talk to about those. And then in knowing what you have, this is where a forest plan comes in handy. And you can do it yourself through programs like the WSU Coached Planning or the My Land Plan from the American Tree Farm System. But you can also talk to a consulting forest or a stewardship forester like me or DNR or WSU, and they can help you with creating those plans. And then knowing what you want to accomplish. So you need to know from the beginning, what are your goals? Are you looking for an economic benefit? Do you want aesthetics? Do you want wildlife? Do you want climate benefits? Do you want all of the above? It's really important when you're trying to make those decisions to know where you want to be going. And as I said, we'll have more links towards the end for places you can go for help, but all the people listed here are definitely good places to start if you're looking for input or feedback. So we're going to start in the past. We're going to give a brief overview of some of the management practices that most forest management is based on. These are still definitely usable techniques, and you'll see that there's benefits to each of them, and there's reasons why they're still being employed today. So the first one is something I'm sure everyone's familiar with. It's the clear-cut harvest. Clear cuts mimic natural stand replacing disturbances like fire, wind, disease, and insect infestation. Clear cutting can happen on a larger stand level, but it can also be on smaller patches. An example for a patch clear cut would be if you have a root rot infestation. Root rot is going to continue to spread throughout a stand when it's composed of the host species. So cutting a section while the trees are still solid wood can provide income that will pay for the replanting to a more tolerant or resistant species. It will also limit the root rot spread to other portions of the property. So you're kind of hitting, you get two birds with one stone there. Some of the main benefits of a clear cut are you get the most bang for your buck. It's the most economic way to go. Because the operators can go faster, it's less expensive, and you're cutting a lot more timber, so you're getting more money from that sale. Another benefit is you have the opportunity to establish a wider variety of species or a group of shade intolerant species, which have very poor growth under a canopy. Douglas fir doesn't really do well if it's under a canopy. Most pine species are also included in that. They just don't do well in the understory. You got another benefit, as you can see here, there's a lot of downed woody debris. This is great for both soil health and habitat. Going more into habitat, this type of a landscape is what we'd call early cereal habitat. This is essential for a lot of different species, a lot of birds, insects, especially native ground nesting bees like this kind of an open area, especially when you're getting that flush of new vegetation like we see on the left. We've got some fireweed coming up. That type is a great attractant. The owls and other raptors love that edge habitat. They can find a perch, they can see everything around them, they can find all the little critters. You'll see large mammals, deer and elk coming in, also attracted to that new vegetation. And a lot of different animals love to use those roads that they think we made for them. They'll take the path of least resistance, so you'll see a lot of activity along those roads. Another benefit is that, speaking of roads, you can usually have an easier access for future management activities if you're creating roads during the clear cut for all-weather access, or using those skid trails that you're bringing logs in. Some considerations for clear cuts is it's going to be a longer period of time until the next harvest. It takes a while for trees to grow, especially to the size that's usable. So if that's your consideration, you want to think about that. You're going to need to pay for replanting after the harvest, and that's usually something that you would take the income from the logs and you set that aside. You're going to run into possible weed issues. You know, as much as it's a great area for native species, it's also a great area for invasive species. So you're going to want to keep on top of those. Another one is it's not as aesthetically pleasing to a lot of people for the first few years. And in that are slash piles. Sometimes you can get some pretty big ones that aren't great to look at. So dealing with those might be something that would turn you away from it. You should also expect increased water, wind, and temperature changes on the microsites within the stand. And you'll have to be aware of soil erosion, especially on any slopes, and plan for that mitigation. The next option is seed tree cuts. So seed tree cuts require some additional planning and marking depending on the site to allow for special placement of those individuals or clusters of trees. You can see in that photo, you can kind of do it two different ways. You can bunch trees together in certain areas, or you can spread individual trees out. You want to pick those for the best distribution of seed throughout the entire stand, because that's in general, you want that to be your only source of planting is that natural seeding. And you'll have to make sure you protect those trees throughout the harvest so that they're not damaged and they stay alive for as long as you need them to be reseeding the stand. And then afterwards, those seed trees can either be left on site for wildlife trees and recruited for large down wood later in life, or harvest them when there's a chance to re-enter the stand. So the benefits to the seed tree is, because you're relying mainly on natural regeneration, that's a less of a cost to you. However, you'll still have to plant some if there's not significant enough regeneration over time. You still get a fairly good income from it when you're comparing it to the clear cut option. You want to make sure your seed trees are really vigorous, viable trees that can produce good seed crops. And you still get a lot of that early cereal habitat and downwood component that's great for wildlife. Some things to consider here are when you leave those individuals or small clusters of trees, they're less resilient to wind throw and other stressors. So you want to make sure they're in really good health, and you kind of want to pick the biggest ones and the best ones to leave. You're still going to have issues with invasive species with this component because you're still creating that wide open space that they love to come into. Next, we have a shelter wood harvest. So a shelter wood is similar to a seed tree, but at a much higher density per acre of those trees that you leave on site. As well as you should expect significant natural regeneration. And that's what you're mostly going to be relying on to repopulate the stand. So depending on your desired species mix, you may need to also plant some in there. This is going to be definitely favoring more shade tolerant species because you're still going to have some of that canopy component in there. And with these leaf trees, you can harvest those later as the younger trees get older. You'll have a pretty significant amount to have a secondary harvest afterward. This is more structurally diverse, but in general, it's still considered to be an even age management technique because the majority of the stand will eventually be that younger component. But for a while, you're going to have kind of that double canopy, which provides some variation for wildlife habitat. And you can choose to leave a larger amount of those trees in there if you'd like, or use those to have snags or other wildlife habitats in there. Okay, and then we're on to commercial thinning. So thinning is the removal of a portion of the stand during the phase which everything's about the same size. This helps to reduce the competition for resources. Largely, you're looking at light and moisture, which can limit the growth of your trees a lot if you're not getting enough of that. Thinning happens naturally in the ecosystem, but it takes a lot longer to occur on nature's timeline. The natural competition can significantly slow growth for a long period of time while those trees are kind of struggling with each other. So the goal of the thinning is to reduce the time trees spend fighting each other for resources and release the trees to let them continue growing at a fast rate. So commercial thinning can generally, you want to ideally have it pay for itself. And then that kind of depends on the size and the species you have. And hopefully you would also be generating a little bit of income that could help down the line. So there's two kind of thoughts for thinning. There's a thinning from above, and that generally means you're taking slightly medium to large trees. What we want to make sure is that we're not high grading the stand or taking, all of the biggest trees. The from above can be implemented so that the bigger trees help to pay for the removal of the smaller trees. Then there's the thinning from below, which is removing the small to medium trees to allow the most dominant trees to remain on the stand and continue to flourish and have that reduced competition. So the benefits here to thinning are increased growth, reduced tree stress. These both are two things that we look at, especially when we're talking later about climate resilience. We want trees to be not as stressed for resources, because once they're stressed, you're a lot more vulnerable to a lot of other issues. Thinning also helps to initiate the understory growth and species diversity. So if you're looking for that multiple layers, if you're wanting to attract wildlife, thinning your stand a bit can help with that. You want to provide space for more shade tolerant trees to come into the stand and create that secondary canopy layer that will eventually overtop the stand you have and replace it. You can also commercially thin multiple times throughout the life of a stand and provide income along the way. Some of the considerations are that thinning is more expensive in general. You have smaller trees and the operator can only go so fast, especially if you want them to be careful and not damage your trees. You also want to look at your soils and your root health. So you'll notice in that picture on the right, the machinery is actually driving on top of the branches of what has been cut down. So that technique is used when doing mechanical cutting to minimize possible compaction and rutting that could damage the root systems of the remaining trees. So the branches basically create kind of a cushion between the machinery and the ground, and eventually in a couple of years that branch pile will just rot away. And then we come to the non-commercial options. So as the name suggests, no direct income comes from these, but the idea is that these techniques will improve forest stands over the long term. So these activities can often be paired with a harvest, but can also be implemented throughout the life of a stand to improve. So depending on the scale, some of these can be done by a landowner with a little bit of equipment, but some will need some more help. Reforestation is one where having an experienced crew is well worth it. Getting plants properly established is one of the most important steps, and crews can plant much faster than you or I, really. They have experience with that, and they know a lot of the issues that can come with planting, and can know how to avoid that. So invasive and competing vegetation management is one that's a little easier to do yourself. It's just as important as a follow-up for your new seedlings through the first couple of years to help with survival. If you've got a lot of blackberry overtopping your seedlings, that's going to stress them out. That's going to limit their growth and possibly cause mortality among those first few years. Pre-commercial thinning is where you're performing a thinning like we talked about previously, but just on a much smaller level. As the picture up here shows, this person's doing their thinning with some hand tools, basically a weed whacker with a blade on it. And so your trees, when you're pre-commercially thinning, should be small enough that you could cut by hand or with power tools. On smaller acreages, this is something only a couple people could work through a year or two. On larger acreages, it's definitely more effective to have a crew come in and do that for you. Okay. So now we move on to a few of the more recent techniques that have risen to prominence in forest management. And one of the big ones there is variable density thinning. So this method kind of combines all the elements of the previous together to create what we would call a mosaic forest. It increases variability within sections of the forest rather than relying on having multiple stands that you're managing kind of separately. The variable density more closely mimics kind of natural life cycles and stand growth while still allowing for the harvest of that commercial product. So there's three basic elements to a variable density thinning. You've got skips, which are areas that are kind of reserved and you really don't do anything, or you do very little in there. And you can leave a skip either just until the next harvest, or you can leave that alone as long as you want. The next one is gaps. Gaps are basically where you're cutting more than the normal around it to create kind of a little open meadow, trying to mimic that early cereal area with that flush of new growth and understory vegetation. And then in between those, you have a thinned matrix from a very light thinning to a fairly heavy thinning, just trying to make a big gradient between all of that. So some of the biggest benefits of variable density thinning is you're speeding up the development of stand complexity. And that also provides for a greater diversity of habitat types within a pretty small area. It is a commercial practice, so you can also get income that helps support other management activities, such as what we talked about before, your non-commercial things. Some of the things to keep in mind are that the income is still not going to be as much compared to other methods. It also requires a minimum amount of forest land to truly incorporate all those methods. It's going to be pretty hard to do that on just a 1 acre area, or something pretty small. There's a lot more interest now in alternative products, one of those being non-timber forest products, or NTFPs. These are things that are not trees, basically, or you're not having to cut down trees in order to harvest these from the stand. And this helps improve the economic benefit while retaining longer rotations or helping pay for non-commercial activities. And these kind of can depend on what local markets you find and what kind of investment you're willing to make to set that up. It can be labor intensive, and it can take a lot of work on your part to gather or manage people who are doing the work here. And other options for income could be specialty timber products. This can be figured wood, like maple wood to make guitars. It could be custom milling for someone who needs, those big beams for their house. You can also look at carbon. There's a lot that's happened in the last several years with carbon marketing, and that doesn't necessarily work for every type of land owner. And depending on the company you're working with, they'll have different restrictions on what you can do with the properties. That's not for everyone yet. I know there are developments being made to make that a little more easy to get into for smaller landowners. Okay. All right, and some other considerations, wildlife habitat is something I get asked about a lot. And as we learn more through research about certain species, we can really start to pinpoint where different animals are looking for habitat and start to include those and provide those in a lot more areas to draw them in. Snags and downwood is one of the biggest attractors for different reasons. Some are attracted because they want shelter or nesting area. Insects are a big one. You can also get small mammals, amphibians, and various birds. And then other species are looking to forage in those areas, like bears ripping apart the logs to get to the insects, and woodpeckers also, digging into those snags. You have understory plantings, which attract pollinators and insects, birds, ungulates, bears, coyotes. Just like downwood, some species are attracted to the food, and some species are attracted because their prey species are attracted. But in general, all of these are pretty important to kind of look at including in your stand. And it's also important to look at that landscape context. Where are wildlife going and where are they coming from? It's great to have those natural corridors through areas where they might have only open space to move through. Some species don't like moving through any kind of an open area because it makes them a target. So if we can create softer edges to the stands that provide that cover, or provide a gradient area where, they're not moving through the open, they still have something to hide underneath. And then we're also looking into the future. As I said before, foresters plan for the future a lot. Forestry is a long-term game, so we're always looking ahead. And thinking about the future, we think about, climate conditions, and it's important to know where we're coming from in order to know how the changes are going to affect us. So in general, the previous disturbance regime of the west side Washington forests has been more low frequency of high severity disturbances, and most insect or disease issues are present at a local or low severity level. And then for what's projected, we're beginning to see more of a higher frequency of larger disturbances at moderate to high severity. So some of this is due to previous fire suppression policy, but some of it is just the climate changing over time, and we're getting more drought and more moisture stress, which causes increased death of trees. And that death could be caused by increased susceptibility to pests and pathogens. And then what might be more common in the future includes higher populations of forest pest insects and increased dead wood that will build up in the landscape rather than biodegrade. So in looking for, from a management standpoint, adjusting that change includes implementing management that will help to reduce stress to trees and make forests more resilient to those long-term stressors and changes. So lowering the stand density reduces stress on trees as they compete for resources, especially when we're looking at moisture in a drought. Having less trees on the landscape trying to draw moisture from the soil is going to be a benefit. Making sure you're managing your invasive species, which will often, turn into a monoculture on the landscape and, take resources away from other plants, which is not good because, a lot of other things depend on those native species to provide them habitat and have that natural biodiversity. Diversity is also one of the biggest ways to protect from one singular stressor, like a disease. You want to have a mix of different species in there so that they can't all get wiped out by the same thing, as well as some of these other techniques. And again, thinking about, the landscape level, if you're a 10-acre forest among 1,000 acres of forest land, you might think about creating open elements. Think about putting something in that's different than around you. If you're a 10-acre forest on like the urban interface, you're going to be thinking about, reducing stressors or providing islands or corridors for wildlife, and as well as, like we talked about last time, that safety around homes and your neighbors. So we're getting towards the end here, so we're going to look at some takeaways. So we have a little compare and contrast here of some of these different methods. This is not definitive, but it's kind of a generalization based on, how you typically do this. You can see there's going to be a variety of potential income, a variety of cost, and then we have just differences in diversity throughout there. Whichever technique you choose, it's definitely important to remember there's going to be benefits and drawbacks to each of those. The good thing to note is that trees want to grow, but also other things do too. So we want to adapt how we manage for those and be looking for ways to improve. So we as foresters want to make your goals happen. So we want to look ahead, look where you want to go. There's a lot of different options out there, but the best method is one that meets your goals. with the resources you have and considering what you want in the future. So we can make that happen. So looking forward, it comes back to long-term goals. Forests work on a long timeline, so we need to think that way too. When you're thinking about managing your forest, legacy planning should be an important thing to think about. There's a lot of different options there, thinking about that ahead of time and discussing it with your family or who you might want to pass your property to is really important, and thinking about working with them on your goals for the property and getting them involved ahead of time is a great way to go. As I said before, I've got some links here, and these slides should be provided when we post the recording, so you'll be able to click through to that. So of course, there's the conservation districts as a resource. There's also the Washington Natural Resource Conservation Service, or NRCS, which provides cost share for some of these practices that you might want to do. There's the DNR Small Forest Landowner Office and the Stewardship Foresters. One I'd like to highlight is the Regulatory Assistance Foresters. This is who you want to talk to, before you're thinking about harvesting. They can help you fill out the required forest practices applications. They can talk with you about some options for working with those. And for our area, Rosalind Hendricks has just joined the DNR team there. So she'd be a good person to reach out to for that. We also have WSU Extension. We have a couple of new faces there, Rebecca Zimmer and Grace Garrison, who are covering Pearson King, as well as Patrick Schultz, who's doing the rest of the Southwest Washington area. You also have forestry consultants. There's lots of places to find consultants. You've got the WSU Consulting Directory, SAF Forestry Directory. If you need more specific arborist help for tree hazard assessment, you can look at the ISA Arborist Directory. You can also look at the Association of Consulting Foresters Directory, and the NRCS TSP, which is Technical Service Provider Directory. I'd also highly encourage everyone to join the local landowner groups. Your peers who are also managing land are some of the best people to get information from about, what they're doing, what they have done, where they see things going, where they've had experience. So the Washington Farm Forestry Association is a great place to look for that, as well as the tree farm program if you're interested in becoming a certified tree farm. All right, and then finally, there's me. If you're interested in talking to me about more management on your forest, there's my contact information, as well as Mark Mead, who I work with. Or you can contact your local conservation district for assistance on other topics. But that's it. And we can go to questions.
Okay, but before we go to questions, and thank you so much, Margaret, that was wonderful. Got me inspired. I'm like, okay, I'm going to walk out in my woods and check it out. Before we go to questions, we have a couple in the chat. Please don't run away, everyone, because Levi, like I said, for his AmeriCorps term of service with us, they have to find out how everyone's doing in learning from our educational activities. So he's going to put the poll questions back up to see how everyone did. So take it away, Levi.
Okay, they should be launched. They should all be out there. And thank you, Margaret, for a great presentation. That's great. Okay. Thank you again, everyone. I think we're good to go to questions.
All right, so since we are recording this and there's folks that are going to watch this that can't see the chat, just so everyone that watches this recording later knows what the questions are. So I'm going to read them out and Margaret's going to answer them. So Cindy is asking, non-timber forest products, does that include beekeeping?
So bees are actually considered a livestock. So they would be under agricultural products. And in terms of domestic honeybees, those are actually a big competitor with our native bee species. So that's something to consider if you're wanting to have bees around for pollination. You know, sometimes attracting those native species might be the better way to go to keep them busy.
Okay, so next one is, please elaborate on wildlife habitat piles, composition and placement.
Sure. So it can really range. You can have smaller piles to larger piles. You know, I think the measurements are, you know, maybe a 10 by 10 structure. You want to start with larger logs on the bottom, you know, maybe 4 to 6 inch or bigger. You want to have something that's going to stack on top and create gaps that, you know, animals can come into. So there are actually different kind of design manuals that are out there for wildlife habitats. So if you want to give me an email, I can find those and send you an example of that.
All right, so next one is, if one has a conservation area as a common area for a community, how would you recommend planning for protection and management of that area for the future?
That would be a complex one. You know, since it's shared, you would really want to try and get everyone involved in that, or work through some kind of a committee to see what you can do or what people are interested in doing. It also depends how big that area is. So just, you know, assuming it's kind of a small community area, you know, talking with people and getting their input is probably the best way to start. I'm not sure how much, you know, long-term protection you can get in that kind of a situation where it might be fluctuating, but certainly starting the conversation is a good way. But if you want to talk about that more, if you want to provide me some more details, we can continue talking about that.
All right, so what thinning technique would be used on a steep, unstable hillside? And then secondarily to this question is, it's a non-commercial area, any resources available to help with non-commercial thinning?
So one of the resources for non-commercial thinning is going to be, you know, the Natural Resource Conservation Service has options for that. Their limitations are, though, that it has to be under a 6-inch average diameter for your trees. I believe DNR is also starting some cost share programs, and they may have more that are especially related to wildfire resiliency that might provide options for some of that thinning. But that would be something I can look into and share some options for you.
And what about the steep, unstable hillside part of that question?
Yeah, so the steep, unstable, it's definitely going to be, you know, not your typical thinning. You're going to want to, you know, look at that through 2 lenses. You're going to look at your tree health as well as your slope stability at the same time. So, you know, that might include leaving all your down material on the soil to kind of hold that in place. And instead of, cutting that up or taking that out of the stand like you might in some others. Or another option would be to be interplanting immediately after that thinning. So you're getting more roots in the ground and keeping that soil covered. You want to try to limit, the amount of water that's, hitting that surface.
Okay, so next one is, I'm looking for ways to manage vine maples which want to continually overtake any open areas. And then, but secondarily to that, are they valuable to wildlife?
Yeah, vine maples can really go at it. They are valuable to wildlife. So, keeping that in mind, you definitely, if they're in an area you really don't want them to be, it's a little bit difficult. Maples in general are really good at resprouting. So you might have to look at, using a cut stump treatment for those with herbicide to kind of eliminate that root system underground. The other option would just be to, cut it all off and then continue cutting so that you kind of exhaust the reserves in there.
Okay, and then Mark's wanting to let everybody else know that another non-timber forest product that he started doing this year is big leaf maple syrup, which I know that UW Pack Forest is doing a lot of experiments on that.
Yeah, that topic's come up a lot in the last couple of years, and I think WSU is going to have a couple of seminars on that too, if that's an interest to other people.
Yeah, I know there's a big leaf maple tapping in the Northwest Facebook page or something like that. Does anybody else have any more questions? And if you don't want to type it in, there's a small enough group of us now, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask. And while everyone's thinking of their questions, I just want to give a little teaser for our field day that we're planning for May. The next webinar is going to be April 21st, as Margaret said, and that one is on invasive species and also stream restoration and what to keep in mind if you do have a stream going through your wooded property. And then in May, though, on Tuesday, we visited a wonderful example of forest stewardship out in Eatonville. So we're cooking up a great field day for you. So keep an eye out on that. I'll send out an email to everyone that has signed up for these webinars. So you'll get some information on that soon. Okay, do we have any more questions?
I don't see any.
Okay, well, thanks so much, everybody, and have a nice evening. Hope to see you in April and then meet you in person in May at the field day.